I'm going to talk about dreams today, and I want to start right out front and tell you I know nothing about dreams. I don't understand them, I don't get them, I don't know where they come from, I don't know what they're trying to say. So let's talk about some dreams in the Bible together and see what's going on with that. Actually, I've heard two things about dreams that I think might be true, but they're not verifiable. But I'm interested if you've heard these things as well. I've heard that you might actually be becoming fluent in a second or third or fourth language if you start having dreams in those languages. Have you ever heard that before? Okay. The other thing that I've heard people talk about and argue about and struggle with is to remember if they actually dream in color or not. Are you sure? Are you confident that you dream in color? I wasn't until I had one dream that answered both of these questions. I can't tell you the whole of the dream. I just remember waking up and thinking to myself, that was really strange that Fred Flintstone was talking to me in Spanish. And then I began to think about that. I knew what Fred Flintstone was saying in Spanish. I can't tell you why Fred Flintstone was talking in Spanish in my world of dreaming. But Fred Flintstone was talking to me in Spanish, and I thought to myself, well, that's great. I might be becoming fluent in Spanish. And then I thought, you know what? I am sure that he was wearing that orange shirt. That's how I knew it was Fred Flintstone. And everything I know about dreams happened in that one dream about 20 years ago. I don't understand dreams. I don't understand where they come from, what they're unleashing in our subconscious. I don't know when I read biblical stories what to make of the dreams that are being told to us there. I'm compelled by the stories of Joseph and Daniel, who seem so adept at interpreting dreams, naming what has happened and then what is coming as well. But I myself, I have no idea what's going on in dreams. I've had people from churches come to me as pastor and ask me what their dreams might possibly mean, and I got no idea. I do not have the gift of Joseph or Daniel, let me tell you. I don't know what's going on in those dreams. But today, we're going to do our best. I'm going to do my best to try to dig into dreams. Well, I should say I learned most of what I know from that one dream with Spanish-speaking Fred Flintstone. But the other thing I learned a lot about dreams from is a movie called Inception. Now, that movie may not know anything about anything, but I was really intrigued. And so the idea of that movie is that it's possible for you to cheat in business by entering into people's dreams and creating worlds and implanting ideas into their dreams. Because the belief, the underlying theory, the philosophy of the movie is that our dreams can affect how we live once we wake up. And so I'm going to show you just a quick clip from that movie where Leonardo DiCaprio is talking about how it's possible to do corporate espionage by shaping worlds inside of people's dreams. Check this out.
When we're asleep.
Dreams are a mystery. Today we're going to talk about the dream of Daniel. And in order to talk about that dream, I want to set it up by reminding you of what's happened to Daniel before he gets to this place of dreaming of large and terrifying monsters and trying to have to sort through what it is he's just dreamed about. Now, the story of Daniel that we're going to read today is in chapter 7, but up until chapter 7, we have learned about him that he has been taken from his homeland. He's been put in jail. His buddies, his closest friends and associates have been thrown into a fiery furnace. He has then interpreted dreams for the Babylonian king, King Nebuchadnezzar. He's seen the king shamed to the point that he became like a goat eating grass out in the field. He's seen the king's son come to power. He's seen that king's power taken away very quickly and seen the entire Babylonian empire sacked. He's been thrown into a lion's den by the new king on accident. It's quite an accident to make. That's what's happened in the first 6 chapters of Daniel, leading into the dream that we're going to read in chapter 7 today. This is a lot of trauma. This is a lot of pain. This is more chaos than any one person should have to deal with. You might imagine that as he goes to sleep tonight, he is probably filled with fear about what tomorrow or next month or next year might have in front of him. He's seen some things. He has struggled. He has hurt. He has longed for things. He's been afraid. He's been in danger. He's had dreams ripped from him. And in chapter 7, we're given an invitation into his sleep cycle to see what it is that he's dreaming about and wrestle with what he's wrestling with and try to make sense of the chaos that's happening within his own dreams. And so we're going to read Daniel chapter 7 today, just verses 1 to 14. And I invite you, if you would, to stand with me as we honor the reading of the word of the Lord today. Daniel chapter 7, verses 1 through 14. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream, and visions passed through his mind as he was lying in bed. He wrote down the substance of his dream. Daniel said, "In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was the 4 winds of heaven, churning up the great sea. 4 great beasts, each of them different from the others, came up out of the sea. The first was like a lion, and it had wings of an eagle. I watched until its wings were torn off, and it was lifted from the ground, so that it stood on 2 feet like a human being, and the mind of a human was given to it. And there before me was a second beast, which looked like a bear. It was raised up on one of its sides and had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. It was told, 'Get up and eat your fill of flesh.' After that I looked, and there before me was another beast, one that looked like a leopard. And on its back it had 4 wings like those of a bird. This beast had 4 heads, and it was given authority to rule. After that, in my vision at night, I looked, and there before me was a 4th beast, terrifying and frightening and very powerful. It had a large iron teeth and crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all the other former beasts, and it had 10 horns. While I was thinking about the horns, there before me was another horn, a little one which came up among them. And 3 of the first horns were uprooted before it. This horn had eyes like the eyes of a human being and a mouth that spoke boastfully. As I looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was as white as snow. The hair of his head was white like a wool. His throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze. A river of fire was flowing, coming out before him. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were opened. Then I continued to watch because of the boastful words the horn was speaking. I kept looking until the beast was slain and its body destroyed and thrown into the blazing fire. The other beasts had been stripped of their authority, but were allowed to live for a period of time. In my vision at night, I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming on the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshiped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. I have a favorite verse in what I just read. It's verse 8, when Daniel says, while I was thinking about the horns. It's a pretty funny thing to see 4 monsters, beasts, creatures, all of them terrifying. And the last one has 10 horns, and Daniel's just sitting there in his dream, pondering the philosophy of horns, thinking about those horns. Have you ever been woken up by a dream and it's been so vivid that you've had to spend time thinking about it to make sense of whether or not it was real? Have you ever been there before? My wife Charisse goes there a lot. It seems to me that most often when she's troubled by dreams, it's because I've died. True story. I can't figure out why it is that I'm in such trouble in her dreams. She's not in trouble, I'm in trouble. The way I see it, it's either she's terrified to lose me, that's kind of sweet, or she's plotting to kill me a lot when she's not talking about it. I figure it's one of those 2 things that leads to her dreams having me in trouble all of the time. She'll wake up in a panic, sweating. It's been so real. I used to have dreams like that. I don't seem to as much anymore. I don't know what to make of that either, because I really don't know anything about dreams. But I know this dream was so vivid to Daniel that he wakes up and he writes it down. And what he sees and what he remembers is terrifying. 4 monsters, 4 different monsters, each of them scary and beastly in their own way. And so let's ask, what is going on with these monsters? I brought a picture that tried to put into frame what it was that's being described here. And each of these things are terrifying. You would not want to step up to either any of these creatures and do battle with any of them. The first was like a lion and it had wings of an eagle. The second was like a bear and it had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. Side note, I really don't get that. The ribs in its teeth sounds scary though. Number 3 is a leopard with 4 heads that had wings like a bird. And the 4th is even more terrifying. Here it's drawn like a dragon or a dinosaur, but the animalness of it isn't described near as much as the horns growing from its head. Either way, these 4 creatures, these monsters, these terrifying beasts are what Daniel is dreaming of while he's in captivity in exile. Now, each of them, we're told as the chapter goes on, represents a different king. And so we see here 4 kings, which is already sort of interesting to think that there's a political nature and it's tied to beasts. That the way the world works, the way that power is distributed in the world that we live in, that the best way that Daniel's brain in its subconscious state can articulate the power that he's seen and known is this beastly, this terrifying, this scary. And each of these kings represent a series of kings that are happening in the world that Daniel lives in. Each of them in a chronology, although to be fair, we don't know exactly for sure which beast equals which empire or which king. There are basically 2 different theories based on solely when you date Daniel was written. And so the first theory is that the first king is Babylon, the second is Media, the third is Persia, and the 4th is Greece. The other theory is that it's Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. But as we read these things from such distance from this time and place, it's easy for us to start reimagining what this, again, we just talked about Revelation for a long time, and we talked about how apocalyptic literature works, right? This is apocalyptic literature in the Old Testament, and it's easy for us to try to assign contemporary value to these things. And there is contemporary value. We'll get there in just one second. But there's also historical value in what Daniel is articulating as well. Most likely, this is a series of very real empires who are causing very real damage to people's lives throughout a series of hundreds of years. And Daniel's mind, as he's dreaming, is imagining these beastly powers unleashed on the world doing the work that is anti-kingdom of God work. You don't cross the kings of massive empires and power. And when you come up against them, it may as well be like facing a bear with ribs between its teeth, or a leopard with bird's wings and 4 heads, or a lion with eagle's wings. And yet, as terrifying as these beasts are, and we ought to be terrified by them, let's not domesticate them. As terrifying as they are, there's a change, a shift that happens in verse 9 of the text that we've looked at today. While these 4 beasts have run rampant and are terrifying Daniel, so much so that he's pondering the horns on the head of the 4th beast. There's a change in the text, and the Ancient of Days shows up. The Ancient of Days is representative of God, of Yahweh, the one who predates history as we understand it. And this strange scene happens where the Ancient of Days has fire protruding out of it in every direction. And a son of man comes on a cloud and meets him. And we're told this son of man will be given dominion over even the beasts of the earth. And that thousands of thousands will attend to him, and 10,000s of 10,000s will come to see him, and that his kingdom is the one that will have no end. There are many, many people who have studied this who believe that Jesus likely referred to himself as the Son of Man with this text in mind. And English interpreters of the old Hebrew and Aramaic languages emphasize into our English that it's a Son of Man that happened here because of how Jesus will describe himself in the New Testament. And so we ought to, with Christian eyes, see here that somehow Daniel is seeing something that he doesn't understand, that he doesn't know, that he can't create a very, very clear theology about, where some sort of Son of Man, a human, will be given authority that belongs only to God, somehow will receive it, and will trample under its foot the beasts like we see here. These beasts have no future because of the Ancient of Days and the Son of Man. As terrifying as these beasts are in the first half of what we read, suddenly the Ancient of Days and the Son of Man show up, and these beasts just disappear. They become neutered. They're not scary anymore. 3 of them just walk around, and 1 of them is utterly and fully defeated and destroyed. When God shows up, when Jesus comes to take his authority, the scariest things that even our dreams can concoct become neutered to the point of worthlessness. When God shows up, that which terrified us in the past becomes a footnote in the story. When God shows up, that which seems so powerful above us suddenly has no power whatsoever over us. When God enters the story, when God enters into the dream, when Daniel no longer sees these beasts but instead sees God, suddenly that which makes them so intimidating just gets undercut to the point of worthlessness. We have a way of becoming so afraid of what's standing in front of us, and we can articulate it in similar ways to this. Yeah, the financial problems I have are like leopards with 4 heads. Yeah, the family drama that I have is like a lion with eagle's wings. The struggles that we have, that we face in our lives, we can make bigger and bigger and bigger. We can articulate them as problems that we cannot solve and are only out to devour us. But how often will we let the story play out just a little further to see what happens when God shows up? When God shows up in this story, these beastly creatures no longer have any power. And yet, in spite of Daniel seeing this, if you would read on in chapter 7, you see that Daniel wakes up and he remains troubled. Verse 28 says this is the end of the matter. I, Daniel, am deeply troubled by my thoughts, and my face turned pale, and I kept the matter to myself. Which is an interesting concept because he probably did keep it to himself. I'll tell you why I know this. You see, chapter 6 is a story of Daniel in the lion's den. You know that story. Daniel's thrown in the lion's den. He sleeps the night in there. The lion doesn't touch him. He wakes up. That's a story of Persia. Persia has overthrown Babylon. So it's a new country, a new empire overseeing the exile of Daniel and his friends. The start of chapter 7 says that this dream happened in the first year of Belshazzar, who's Nebuchadnezzar's son, which is a Babylonian king. And so the story of Daniel is thrown way out of chronological order. Chapter 6 happens after chapter 7 in reality. And so we're given this story almost attached or edited to the end of the story that's already unfolded. Daniel will go into the lion's den years after he actually has this dream. This dream is told to us later on, even though what has happened in the lion's den won't happen into the future after this dream. This is edited in. Daniel keeps the matter to himself. And so we should ask ourselves, what exactly is it that Daniel is afraid of? Because we've been shown these beasts. These beasts are terrifying. I can understand being afraid of it. But let's take this to the logical end. At the end of the dream, God has trampled the beasts. The beasts are scary, yes, but they are defeated in his own dream. So what in the world is it that he is afraid of? Well, I started wondering this week, what if what he is afraid of is not only the beasts, but also the Ancient of Days that he sees? You see, we can get in the way of reading good and evil in our stories, that every time we come across what is good, we assign all sorts of good to it. And among the good things that we might assign to good is, well, that's not scary. I'm attracted to what's good. You see, the beasts, that's scary, that's bad, I want nothing to do with them, they can't do any good. And the good guy comes in this instance, the Ancient of Days God, and we think, well, everything he must do must be great. But let's just think again about how this is described to us. I have another picture of art here of showing what God might have looked like in this story. We're told he sits on a throne and fire protrudes from him in every direction. Now, I want you to see the Ancient of Days, God, as the good guy who puts down the evil in this text, no doubt. But if you were to actually see with your own eyes God, you'd probably be pretty afraid. You'd probably be a little terrified by this spiritual being on a throne with fire protruding out of it from every single direction. If you weren't clued in the text that this was the good guy, you would probably be every bit as afraid of God as you are of the beasts, because it's outside of our everyday normal comfort level. But here's the problem that I have in reading the Old Testament and the New Testament alike, is that we have done so much work on the front end to create theologies of God's love and God's goodness and God's kindness, that at a certain point we can domesticate God down to a safe little theology that fits in a nice little box, and we open it up and we take God out whenever it does its best to help us. We neuter God so often into something safe and cute and pretty that we take out when we need power, help, healing. And then we put our safe little God back in his box and put him away whenever we want to do things our way. But read this text away from our theologies, and the God that Daniel has encountered is every bit as terrifying and apocalyptic and outside of our normal as the beasts. The good news is that we're clued in through Daniel that we want to be on the side of the terrifying Ancient of Days. And sure enough, we do. The beasts need to be defeated, but when we meet this Ancient of Days, there's something kind of scary and unsettling about him as well. I think back all of the time to Moses' simple request on the side of the mountain after the Exodus that he'd like to see the face of this God who's unsettled his life and made him face up against the most powerful man in the world and has now put him in charge of an entire nation of people. That's a pretty simple request, I think. Moses just says, God, let me see you. Let me see your glory. I want to know your essence. I want to know who in the world you are that you have done all of this. And God's response to him is, oh, I can't do that. What? He said, well, if you saw me, you would die. You can't handle the fullness of all that I am. And so they make this bargain that God's glory will pass by the cleft of the rock in the mountain, and Moses will look on the behind of him, not upon his face. And Moses' physiology changes. He lights up like a night light and walks down the mountain, and everyone is like, whoa, Moses is glowing now. The God that we're told about in the Old Testament over and over and over isn't neat and simple and domesticated, doesn't fit in nice tiny little boxes. The God that we're told of in the Old Testament over and over and over inspires fear, not to be afraid, but to recognize how big and powerful, how awesome and mighty this God is. And so Daniel's dream breaks down like this. He's got on the one side 4 beasts. They're a lion, a bear, a leopard. They're one with iron teeth and horns. There's eagle's wings attached. There's ribs for teeth. There's 10 horns growing out of one of them. That's scary, but then the God, the Ancient of Days that he sees as well, has a throne ablaze with fire. He's got a river of fire flowing out of him. He's got thousands of attendants and tens of thousands of followers. And he also has this Son of Man coming on him towards clouds. Now, choose your fighter. Both of them are kind of terrifying if you think about it. And so, the Ancient of Days meets his Son of Man. And Daniel is confused. Because whatever it is that God is acting and doing doesn't fit into his theology. Daniel's a smart guy. He grew up in Hebrew school. He understands and knows God. He's done, to this point, some pretty incredible things for God. He's heard God's voice in ways that his fellow young men who have been exiled out of their home have not. He's made the right choice over and over and over because he knows God. And yet, this Ancient of Days with fire and this Son of Man coming on a cloud, putting down all the beasts of the earth, this should be good news, and yet Daniel he just can't make sense of any of this. Now, you and I have the good fortune of having met Jesus in the New Testament, so we can begin to fit in our Jesus theology into this, and we can begin to make some sense about what is happening here. But imagine Daniel for a second. He's never heard of Jesus of Nazareth in his life. It doesn't make sense to him what God is doing or who God is or what God is up to in this text. And so to think about it, the best way I can think about how to talk about this is through a book that I imagine many of you are familiar with, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. There is a particular scene in that book that is so meaningful and helpful to me, and I hope to remind you of it. If not, I'll just tell you about it for the first time. This was written like 100 years ago, so spoiler alerts are off, okay? If you're afraid I'm going to spoil The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, just tune out for 2 minutes, okay? I'll be done. The story basically goes that Aslan is a lion who is the messianic figure. We're supposed to think Jesus when we see Aslan. And so there are these 4 kids from Earth, like you and I, who end up in Narnia, and they find out that there's this entire chaotic scene happening in Narnia, where the witch is putting people under a spell, and it appears that Aslan might be the one who can save them from this spell. And the humans, like you and I, are children, and they're trying to get to the bottom of what's happening and understand Aslan. And so one of the kids asks a beaver, of all things, you're just going to have to trust me here if you've not read the book, is Aslan safe? Is Aslan safe? And Mr. Beaver says, no, he's a lion. He's not safe, but he's good. And that is such a powerful moment for me in that story. Now, Aslan is not Jesus. The beaver is not a prophet. However, it's making a point that is really potentially helpful even for us to understand this text. Daniel has this dream and he sees God, and the question might be, whoa, is this God safe? There's fire everywhere. Fire, rivers of fire coming out of him. His throne looks like it's on fire. Is he safe? No. But the question that Daniel needs to ask himself is, but is this God good? And so the question I ask you today as we close out is, what if we stop seeing God as safe? What if we stop seeing God as packageable? What if we stop seeing God as doctrine? What if we stopped understanding and knowing and being able to describe exactly what God's going to do at all times? What if we stopped seeing God as safe? What if this vision taught us, especially in the fact that it's out of order chronologically, what if it taught us that Daniel has this dream before he ever knows about a King Darius or a lion's den? And what if coming out of this dream, Daniel becomes a little more brave about the world he's going to face? Because he may see beasts everywhere. The lion's den is a beast. The king who throws him there is a beast. The people who trick him are beasts. We face scary things around every corner. But what if the lesson that Daniel learned is that God isn't a nice, soft, domesticated God who's kind of put off by the beasts of this world, but instead is something that's just a little terrifying even to us, but terrifies the beasts and the monsters that we stand up against? What if the only thing that could defeat beasts and monsters in our life is a God that's even more scary than the beasts and the monsters that we face? What if the fact that Daniel sees a God that is unsettling becomes what gives him bravery to face the next beast or the monster that he's going to face? Because he doesn't serve a domesticated, docile, put-in-a-box God, but instead one that's consumed with fire and is terrifying. And it seems even terrifies the kings of this very world. What if we stopped seeing God as safe? So to close out today, I'm going to ask the question that I've been asking every week. What are the monsters in your life? What is it that causes you stress? If you were to write down all of the things that trouble you and put it into one of these word pictures, what would it look like? What are the things that you have created in your own world that have ribs between its teeth and eagle's wings, that just get bigger and badder and scarier every single day? It could be something in your life that is internal. It could be external. It could even be eternal. But what if instead of getting fixated on things like finances or family or fear or friends or foes, what if instead we get fixated on a God that's bigger and scarier than those monsters we face in our life? What if we shifted our gaze away from the monsters and instead gazed upon the God that has fire protruding from its throne and rivers of fire that flow out of it? What if instead of being so afraid of the things that are difficult about this life, we readdressed ourselves to a fear of God and thought, what if this God is on my side? And so I brought a picture to close out today of monsters that look silly and scary. Now, these aren't quite as terrifying as the ones shown to us in Daniel chapter 7. Any one of these things look like one little bop to the nose and they'd be out. What if we learned that God isn't safe, but that God is good? What if we learned that God has a plan to overwhelm the monsters in our life? Maybe they would neuter our fear just a little bit. Maybe if we rightly placed our fear in God instead of the things that trouble us in this world, the monsters would start looking a little bit more silly like this, and a little bit more afraid of our God. And we might be more properly aligned to the way that God has called us to live our life. The troubles will catch up to us. The troubles will come. We're not promised to get out of this life unharmed. But God overwhelms the monsters that we face. God is scarier to the monsters than the monsters are to us. We're going to sing a final song of closing, a song about promises that God has made. And as a reflection of this, I want to invite you to lean on, to think about, to wrestle with, to reimagine the promises that God has given you. And whatever it is you're facing this week, in your personal life, in your work life, in your family life, remember that God has given us an unbelievable amount of promises of His goodness and His help and His willingness and ability to show up and to overwhelm the struggles that we face. Find God's promises again as we sing this closing song together. Would you stand with me as we close out today?